Welcome to another of my clock restoration projects. This one, an Italian three-train lantern clock, which I brought in from Italy earlier on in 2021. I purchased this clock because it had some very unique features, and it borders on lantern or turret clock, and I'll explain some of that as we go on. Only occasionally do clocks of this quality and caliber come up for sale, and very rarely at all outside of Italy. So to be able to find something complete, unique, without any modification or damage is quite rare. But often in Italy, the rare happens. And I found this auction in April of this year, which had 4 Italian-made lantern clocks for sale. And surprisingly, they weren't as expensive as you'd expect. And I think that's all due to the fact that COVID has really knocked the antiques market for 6, particularly in Italy, which, if you remember, was one of the worst hit countries at the very beginning of the COVID epidemic. Nevertheless, this item is described as a lantern clock. It's a 3-train movement with a verge escapement and a short cowtail pendulum out over the front of the dial. It has 2 bells and it strikes quarters and the hours. In over 250 years, this clock had been appreciated and looked after, except for the fact that the finials, 4 at top of the posts and 1 on top of the bell, had been hacked off for no apparent reason. I've applied a few photoshopped finials to the top of the clock so I could see what it could have or would have looked like when it was brand new. Prior to bidding on this clock in Italy, I wanted to be sure that everything I was looking at was the real thing. So my research on the internet turned up this 2-train model on the right, and as you can see from it, almost identical in terms of dial layout, the decoration above the dial, 2 bells. The mechanism looks very similar with iron top and bottom frame plates. The only difference being that since it's only a 2-train, it only needs the 4 feet, but with the 3-train, where there's extra load to be carried, there are 6 feet. Here are some of the features of the dial and the dial plate. The dial chapter ring is actually 10 inches in diameter, which puts it in the same league as some of the earliest of the single-handed long case clocks. The dial plate itself is very interesting in that it's been hand beaten back in that dimple matting to raise the pattern, and then the pattern has been engraved into that foliate design with some animation, and above the dial is the fret, which has been engraved with 2 sea monsters blowing a gale. These are most often seen on maps contemporary to the clock, where the sea monsters are out in the ocean blowing the gale to drive ships across the oceans of the old world. This is the picture that really got me when I saw it on the auction site. Rather unique 3-train movement in iron frame plates, iron pillars to the case frame, and have a look at those vertical movement plates. The splayed feet at the bottom with decoration. Totally unnecessary decoration, never to be seen, but a quality workmanship. Also, the internal toothed locking plate on the hour train was very unique. and I only found similar applications of technology in turret clocks. Hence, I'm inclined to believe that this is a lantern-styled turret clock movement. These pictures show the sides of the movement, and the side marked right is the strike for the hour with the vertical hammer post, and the one marked left side is for the quarter hours and its vertical hammer. Here is a view of the top of the clock, and on top of the iron horizontal top plate you can see the escape wheel or crown wheel, the arbor of which comes up through the top plate to carry that wheel in a horizontal rotating position. Crossing over the dead center of the escape wheel is the pallet arbor, which is carried in that rear pivot holder, and that arbor extends out through the front of the dial to carry the pendulum. And on that arbor are the two pallet flags which operate into opposite sides of the crown wheel. Unfortunately, there's no maker's name on this clock, although whoever made it did go to the trouble of putting the date on it, and it's AD 1760. I've checked through all of my books and references, and I could not find any maker called Anno Domini. He's a very famous maker, of course. I have been calling this clock a lantern clock, and it does have lantern clock attributes such as turned brass feet, turned brass finials, albeit hacked off, a beautifully engraved cast brass fret, a cowtail pendulum hanging in front of the dial, often seen on lantern clocks and often seen on smaller wall clocks. However, there the similarities end, because lantern clocks are defined by having a time train and a striking train behind each other, perpendicular to the dial, extending away from the back of the dial. This clock, however, has three trains side by side, and that layout is more like tower clock. Here you can see a drawing of a tower clock movement design according to Maggio in 1766, and you can see that it has the three trains side by side in an iron strapped frame, and there is a center foot to carry the load of the weights for the center train. So in truth, this clock could be defined as a lantern cased tower clock movement in miniature. Here are some pictures of clocks contemporary to my lantern clock, and you can see the center foot on the strapped iron framed clock, and on the right you can see internally toothed count wheels or locking plates as found on this type of early tower clock mechanism. Very early technology, usually all hand cut. With the finials having been hacked off at the top of the pillars or posts, the clock just didn't look right in my eyes. So I proceeded to turn up some finials in keeping with the age and style that would have been found on this clock, and very similar to the ones on the two-train clock that I'd seen earlier on in my research. I turned one up first to get a feeling for the height of the finials so that they didn't look out of proportion with the fret and the dial. This clock is amazing in that every wheel in this clock has been hand cut in the teeth of every wheel. And here on one of the wheels from the motion work, you can see how it's been geometrically laid out, and the tips of every tooth been punched and it filed out. How crude are the teeth. There are no two teeth alike. And being in the motion work, this wheel has been grooved so that the washer, the spring washer behind this particular wheel gave more grip for the hand tension spring washer to transfer the drive from the wheel to the hands. This clock was in such complete original condition that I did not want to destroy the originality of this clock. It was running, albeit very worn, but at least it would run. However, the striking trains were so badly worn that they would mislock, or they would strike the wrong number at the wrong time, and there was no alternative but to rebush the arbors that carry the detents for both the hour and the quarter hours to take out the slop and the play that was causing errors in the striking system. That was all that I had to do to improve the performance of this original clock. It has never been damaged or butchered or modified in all of its life. So having done minor repairs and a few decorative additions such as the finials, the clock was complete and running. More a conservation than a restoration. I then needed to consider how to display this clock. It weighs over 10 kilos alone. The weights weigh another 11 kilos. So in total I have 21 kilos of clock and weights to display. I was not prepared to put it on the wall. I needed some other way to display this clock. After lengthy consideration, I finally decided on making a very tall stand for the clock, much like a clockmaker's horse. However, this one was to be taller because it had to have at least a 12-hour drop for the weights. I had old mahogany from a wardrobe that I had in my shed, and I made up some legs, turned some feet and some capitals, and proceeded to make a very tall, fine stand for the clock. Here you can see the stand in raw timber, basically ready now for staining and varnishing. But now you can appreciate how tall this stand is. I'm a 6 foot tall person, and that clock is up level with the top of my head, which puts it at exactly the same position as a long case clock. When I stand in front of this clock, I'm looking at the numeral 6, and when I'm standing in front of a long case clock, again, I'm staring at the numeral 6. So the stand is basically taking the place of a long case cabinet. There was not going to be just a lump of lead driving this clock. I wanted something a little bit more decorative in keeping with the quality of the clock. And I had this movement weight in the cupboard, and it had this unusual patterned top. I cast from that into plaster of Paris to make a mould, and once the plaster of Paris had dried after about 2 weeks, I was then able to melt some spelter and pour that into the mould and produce the cast top you can see here on the right. I had already determined the weights required for each of the trains, for the quarter train, the time train, and the hour train. And based on the volume that amount of lead would be required, and using an internet available template maker for a truncated cone, I was able to develop templates that I would use to make brass shells to fit underneath the cast decorative caps and tops that I'd made. And here you can see a truncated cone template with a 48mm diameter at the top, a 58mm diameter at the bottom, and a height of 156mm. And those dimensions would give me a weight, when full of lead, of 3.4 kilograms. The shells that I was going to make for these tops was old brass, and the tops were spelter, and they would not take the same age or character as the brass. So I copper plated the spelter tops, and they'd aged them so that they look a little bit more in keeping with the rest of the clock. Here I have wrapped the paper template around the brass and then marked onto the brass the shape for the template. I then proceed to cut out the brass, and then it will roll up into the required truncated cone to fit under the cast cap. Here is the brass being cut out into the template shape, then rolled around on the underside of the cap. You'll notice that I've soldered it onto the cap, and I've soldered the side seam purely to hold it in shape until I'm ready to cast it. I secure the top and bottom with hose clamps because that solder will melt when the lead goes in, and it has to be quite firm, otherwise leakage will occur. To fill it with lead, I simply invert this truncated cone into a sand box so that the sand comes right up to the open bottom, and the lead is then melted and poured down into the brass shell. It may not be possible to melt upwards of 5 kilos in one go, so I would do 2 to 3 melts, but internally I will have a zigzag piece of wire extending from the very bottom to the very top, so that that locks all of the subsequent pours into one unit. So here are the 3 weights: quarter striking on the left, time and then hours on the right, all with brass shells which have been aged, and the caps have all been treated with a copper plating and then some aging and a little bit of gilt paste applied to give them a bit of character. Here's the finished clock, fully conserved, looking magnificent on its dark stained mahogany 1.57 metre tall slender stand. Not in danger of collapsing, but certainly out of the way of passing traffic. I believe the clock now looks every bit as grand as it did when it was first made in 1760, and I hope you will agree. That concludes this presentation on the restoration of this beautiful 3-train Italian clock. Thank you for watching. I trust it inspired you. Until next time, goodbye.